I'm an assistant professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies at ASU. And today we have Johanna Hiitola, who is the Director of Gender Studies at the University of Oulu in Finland. And so Johanna is also an associate professor in social and public policy, as well as social work. And her research focuses on a wide range of topics that include feminist family studies, as well as forced migration and citizenship. And so today she'll be talking about forced migration from a European perspective in particular. So we'll start today with the talk, which should last about 30 minutes, and then we'll save all Q&A for after the talk. And so for those of you that are on Zoom, please feel free to just use the chat function on Zoom to add any questions that you have, and then we'll go through those once the talk is over. So with that, I will hand it over to our guest. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So how many people are online?
We have 5 right now.
Okay.
5, 6.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Okay. So I will speak from the paper a little bit, just because when I speak in English, I tend to get lost with words. But so now I don't know. I should look in the in the camera, maybe, or look at you. So in this talk, really, I paint a picture of present-day politics around forced migration in Europe, and particularly from the viewpoint of the Nordic welfare states, of course, because that's the field I know. But also in connection to the new refugee situation in Europe. The focus to two-way integration comes from the project Mobile Futures. You see our logo there, in which I take part currently. So anyway, the concept of two-way integration really just means that it is not enough that an individual strives to adapt to the society as a whole, but the society as a whole also needs to participate. So for example, this could mean that instead of only focusing on refugees' individual skills and possibilities to get work, a two-way process could also stress the need for support for language learning or other inclusive workplace policies in the places of work. You can change now. So I ground my research into the research field of refugee studies and especially on forced migration. You can put another. By forced migration, I refer to the often mentioned categories of mobilities, which are internally displaced people, victims of human trafficking, asylum seekers, refugees, and stateless people. However, I must also say, much like many scholars, other scholars have pointed out that the categories are, and you can click, ill-defined and overlapping. And the reasons behind migration often combine both voluntary and involuntary factors. In addition, and related to social class, some migrants might be able to utilize so-called voluntary categories for mobility, even if the reasons behind the move were compelling. These categories may lose their descriptive meaning, especially when analyzing everyday experiences, and you can tap which result to fleeing, but the consequences of different categories of protection are extremely significant. For example, the refugee status includes protections and possibilities often not found in other residence permits. People receiving other types of international protection face more legal restrictions and other hurdles, for example, in reaching family unity or attaining basic services and benefits. In addition, many forced migrants never reach a formal status in the receiving society. So in this talk, I draw examples from my own empirical postdoctoral work. Here in the slide are a few of the different works which I have written and edited in the last 5 years. I especially want to mention our new book, Forced Migration and Separated Families. You see here, it's an open access book, and it just came out last week. So please read our chapters. And your scholar Lane Munir is also writing about forced migration and queer identity in this book. So I also really want to thank Line for inviting me here today. And also what I forgot from the beginning is thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so happy to be able to engage with you today. So the projects where I draw from are an ethnographic study with the resettled Afghan community in a small Finnish town, conducted from 2016 to 2018. I also draw from a study on family reunification policies and everyday security of refugees, which was conducted between 2018 and 2020. Some of my thoughts are also formed in my present research on Finnish integration policies and everyday bureaucracies connected to forced migrants services, and also from a project I just started on transnational child protection cases. And now you can change. And here's our research group, or at least part of it. Just wanted to also give credit to the people with whom I work with. Great, lovely bunch of people. So these people have been essential in developing the ideas which I will be sharing with you today. And you can change. And click again. I was going to be completely, no. Completely smooth with this at the top. No, it's not so smooth. So when I was giving a practice talk at Irvine, I got a comment that I really need to start with showing a map. So here it is. The viewpoint from which I'm discussing forced migration is tied to my geographical position, of course, as a Finnish citizen. Right now, as you can see from the map, as a country, we are in a precarious position next to Russia, which has just invaded a sovereign country, Ukraine, not that far from us. And more so, also our own refugee history caused by the Soviet attacks is not so far. So here is another map. Now you can click it. Which shows the areas that Russia invaded and kept after the Second Soviet-Finnish War, which took place during World War II. My own family were from this area that you see here in red, and they had to flee twice during the war as the regions were invaded. And now, of course, we lost all the different family farms. I think this emotional burden of our own history makes this current offensive seem even closer. So there's this affective aspect to this. So now you can click again. See, I have all this stuff together. So finally, you see one of the most famous paintings in Finland here. This is Edward Isto's painting, Attack, where the two-headed eagle of Russia is tearing away the Finnish maiden's law book. So we have some definite baggage as a nation, but I actually wanted to stress a different point with this picture. Zooming a bit on the portrait of the Finnish maiden, which is a cultural icon portrait in poetry and arts in Finland, I wanted to point out how Finland has a national discourse according to which it has remained monocultural and an outsider of colonialism for much longer than its neighboring countries of Sweden and Norway, for example. It is true that Finland has mostly been a country of emigration rather than migration until the 90s, when the first larger groups of refugees resettled in Finland. It was Somali refugees at the time who came in largest numbers. However, as a decolonial feminist scholar, I truly question this narrative of homogeneity. I think, like many other critical scholars, that the whole discourse is based on a very narrow understanding of migratory movements and minorities in general. Finland has a large Sami indigenous population, a large Roma community of travelers who have resided in Finland for hundreds of years. Russian refugees who have resettled in Finland since early 1900s, lots of migrants and Finns with Swedish and Russian roots. Estonians who live transnationally between Finland and Estonia, also an old Muslim Tatar minority, and we have also accepted smaller groups of refugees since the Vietnam War. And of course, our internal evacuees, which I was talking about earlier, who had to leave the areas which Russia invaded in the Russian-Finnish wars. So I really wouldn't call Finland monocultural, but perhaps it may be said that the history of migratory movement to Finland is quite short. Nonetheless, I think this picture captures also the national rhetoric of purity of the Finnish maiden, which is under a threat. There's certainly a sort of a white nationalist tone to this rhetoric also. And then the next slide. In this talk, I draw from two main migratory movements. The first one is the mass migration to Europe in 2015, when due to several ongoing conflicts and climate-related emergencies, a large group of asylum seekers headed for Europe from different countries from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. The largest groups were Syrians fleeing the war, but several different routes were used, like you can see from this picture. An estimated 1.3 million people seeked asylum within 1 year, which was the most in a single year in Europe since World War II. 30,000 people applied for asylum in Finland. Most came through Sweden, but not Swedish applicants, but came through there. But some also came through Russia. In the Finnish media, this number of people was presented as crisis and even a threat to national security. And not only in Finland, but throughout Europe. You can change. Here you see just two examples of what was written about the migratory movement in 2015. People fleeing war, conflict, and poor living conditions were labeled crisis, waves, influx. It was a struggle to respond, and so forth. Also, most of the asylum seekers and refugees at the time were young men, which was quickly picked up as the main theme in populist politics. So it soon became an issue of protecting Europe against what was seen as an invasion. Religious stereotypes and blatant racism was certainly part of the rhetoric. As a result, most Europe essentially closed national borders from freedom of movement that has characterized the member states since the 90s. So this was a big event. And then next. And here is a cartoon by Osama Hassai from the French site called Cartooning for Peace. I think that you will all know where this talk is going now. I will just guide you through a few things that happened after the 2015 migratory movement. So first of all, the European member states closed their borders one by one. This really resulted in a situation where families got scattered around inside and outside Europe. Many of the men who had arrived in 2015 in the hopes for reuniting with their families later, the policies changed so rapidly after they had come that almost all were unable to actually reunite with their families. This created quite a strange situation where accepting refugees was argued against with discourses that focused on the threat that single Muslim men posed, but simultaneously on the policy level, family reunification got so difficult that most men really did lose their families, or had to make a choice between staying in Europe and sending money to their families in the refugee camps, or returning to conflict or camp life themselves. For example, as of today, many migrants who arrived during my fieldwork in 2016 are still waiting for their permanent residency permits, or their family reunification decisions. Many have also been deported, and many have simply left as the situation has been unbearable. So then came 2021, and Russia viciously attacked Ukraine, creating now even a bigger refugee situation in Europe. But now, without any hesitation and with great urgency, all the EU member states opened their borders to Ukrainian refugees. And even a new category of temporary protection was created for Ukrainians and Ukrainian residents who were fleeing the conflict. What the situation looked like to those who had themselves arrived to Europe in 2015 or were closely involved in assisting the refugees was exactly like this cartoon portrays. It seemed to really shed light to the racialized dynamics at play in refugee reception. So in the years since the Russian attack on Ukraine, already about 8 million people have registered for temporary protection in Europe. In this graph, it says 5 million, but this is from January, and 8 million is the current number. Also, if the refugee situation is evaluated by the number of border crossings and not actual applications, then estimates say it's about 17 million people who have fled Ukraine, and also if people fleeing to Russia are counted in. So this situation is is in much greater scale than the 2015 migratory movement. Only the neighboring Poland has taken in more people than the whole of Europe took in 2015. And let me just quickly show you a snapshot of news from last Friday, if you click again. So you see how the crisis is now contributed to failed housing, so failing to protect the refugees, refugee centers closing. It's a desperate fight. There really isn't any similar news about the dangers with which these refugees pose that existed in the much smaller 2015 movement. So now that I have established this, I will get into my actual topic today. I want to show you how the legislative framework for protection is only one aspect of the well-being of resettled forced migrants. Now you can. So in trying to, go back. In trying to make sense of this overwhelmingly different approach, I suggest that the term welfare state nationalism might be handy. This refers to a belief that welfare benefits should be restricted only to certain groups who are seen to belong in to the nation. Some scholars, like feminist sociologist Suvi Keskinen, calls this type of thinking welfare chauvinism, which is a very closely related term, when analyzing argumentation strategies by right-wing populist parties. Closely integrated phenomena is the belief that different outsiders of the welfare state project, which is very strong in Finland and in the other Nordic countries, is that kind of the outsiders may endanger the already established equality within the nations. So in a really twisted way, it is believed that migrants with Muslim background would threaten the welfare state system, as the religion itself is seen as being against the ideals of gender equality. This results to a situation where, in the name of equality, people are grossly discriminated against due to their race, ethnicity, and religion. So I think that this belief offers, or this rhetoric offers, the best explanation for how the situation has evolved. And now you can change the slide just a little bit. So, however, I also claim that welfare state nationalism is not only a rhetoric. The following chart presents just a few of the recent changes in immigration policies in Finland. I could have built this whole talk around these changes, but they may also get a little bit boring. So I'll just mention one which has relevance for the rest of the talk. The legal reform in 2015 is on bold here. It links to the recent policy developments concerning Ukrainian refugees. So for years, activists had organized and protested against these temporary residence permits, which were given to those asylum seekers in Finland before 2015, who could not be deported but did not qualify for international protection either. They were given a permit which did not grant them equal access to welfare benefits or the possibility to work, but instead they had to rely on the small monetary benefits given by the reception centers and could usually not afford to live elsewhere. Also, the children didn't have the right for early education, and so daycare services were kind of out of reach for this group of people. But so what the government then decided was to take out the possibility of the temporary residency altogether in 2015. This created a huge issue with people ending up without residency. So really, Finland created the phenomenon of undocumented residents in 2015 with this policy change. It was almost non-existent in Finland before then. We are a highly bureaucratic society, so everything is on file usually. So before the people who could not be deported to the countries of origin were given temporary residency, now their residence permit just ended and they were told that they have to voluntarily return. But there was, of course, nothing voluntary about it, as these people had no possibilities to return, nor to kind of link into the society in any way. So then next one. To illustrate my point of what all these different restrictions did, here's an example from a research participant, Pant, who is a young Afghan man who had first come to Finland when he was only 15 years old. He had lost his brother in Turkey after their parents died, and he was forced into a smuggling boat alone. When first coming to Finland in 2015, he spent 2 years looking for his brother with the help of different voluntary organizations. He finally found him in Turkey. The brother was only 12 years old at the time. He was 12 when he was left there, and now he was about 14. And the older brother was himself also still a minor at the time of the interview. And the little brother was living on the streets. And let me now read this excerpt. So the young man says, I talked to my social worker here about my little brother who's alone in Turkey. Could he get there? She said, yes, you can apply for family reunification. But she didn't do it well. She just said like that. And then I asked, but she didn't really help? Yes, the application is really complicated. And the interviewee says, yes, she did not really help. She didn't know how. Then one day I went to ask her what I could do, and she said, go to Turkey, register your little brother to UNHCR office, and go with that paper to the Finnish embassy. You can do the application there. Okay, so again I went to Turkey. I registered my brother and I got a paper. Then I went to the Finnish embassy in Ankara. At the door, I said that I came from Finland and I need to make a family reunification application. Then someone inside asked if I spoke Finnish. I spoke to him and he said that we don't deal with Afghans here in Turkey. You have to go to New Delhi, India, with your brother. And so at this point, when he's told that he has to go to India to do the family reunification application, the brother doesn't have any identification. He's living on the street, and they are both minors. And they didn't even take the application in the Finnish embassy. So in my previous project on family separation of refugees, we thought about different securities both on the level of discourses and everyday lives. What this interview here talks about is a result of a legislative change and a reinforcing policy which limited the ways to apply for family-based permits. So it's a question of a rhetoric on national security versus individual everyday security. For this young man, the effects were devastating. His brother stayed unprotected in Turkey. He was actually able to eventually travel with the brother to India and submit the application. Just think of the money all these arrangements took. But then later, the whole application was denied as the older brother was not seen as the main financial supporter of the little brother. Of course, he hadn't been because the little brother had been lost for so many years. So I would love to read you more examples from my fieldwork, but you'll have to read. I put the book there. Read the book as it just came out. But now you can change the slide. So here are just a few statistics which show the number of applications in Finland. So there you see the supposedly huge crisis of 2015, and then the situation right now. But you can also see that the year 2016, so after 2015, marked a year where most applicants started to receive negative decisions. And these were applicants from countries in the Middle East, different countries from the African continent, Asia. Compared to the current situation, the number of applications was, of course, quite low. And what is really visible here is that the 2015 arrivals, they almost all got negative decisions, whereas these blue ones are signifying the Ukrainian crisis right now, and they are all almost all granted. So right now, the majority of asylum seekers coming to Finland are coming from Ukraine, but also Russians are granted asylum for political persecution, and a growing number of Russian LGBTQ people are applying right now. But other groups are a little bit smaller due to restrictions, stronger restrictions on border controls. Now you can change. So I have now presented you a picture which shows that the two most recent larger refugee arrivals to Finland were dealt with in quite different ways, politically and concretely within the immigration system. There were also real-life differences for the arriving people. Whereas the 2015 arrivals were greeted with far-right attacks, even violence and hostile police officers, the 2021 arrivals met a whole community of support. Especially during the first few months of the Russian-Ukrainian war, it was an unanimous front of individual people, officials, and bureaucrats alike who welcomed the newcomers. But maybe now we need to also look a bit closer to the everyday lives of the people arriving. Remember when I told you about the temporary residency, which was taken out of the legislation in 2015 and which resulted to a large group of undocumented migrants, and really was the starting point of the whole phenomena in Finland. So what the government did was that they reinstalled that secondary permit to be used for Ukrainians and to satisfy the EU level requirements for quick residency. This, of course, had some major pitfalls. So temporary residency didn't grant people the right for welfare benefits and services, although unlike the previous similar category, it now did include the right to work. But since most arrivals were women and their small children, it was hard for many to jump to full-time work in a new country, having no support for childcare and such. So since the Ukrainian families were not eligible for Finnish social security, just caring for the children was a barrier in being able to stay. Many women were also completely wrapped up with war news, as their husbands and sometimes also adult children were still in Ukraine. Often, or quite soon, it became apparent that integration programs didn't fit this group at all. Most Ukrainians actually wanted to return as soon as possible. At this point, in the beginning, many also thought that the war would end in a few months, so they weren't coming to stay. So the main point was that actually, although there was work available for those who were willing to do it, but it was mostly low-paid work. After taxes, the pay was often too little to pay rent and sustain the family. So many mothers who initially worked stopped working and moved back to the reception centers to live off the small benefits. In addition, the temporary protection is only granted for 6 months at a time, so people need to be constantly applying and reapplying for the residency, but with no actual possibilities to join the society. So, whether it's due to our system or the nature of the war in Ukraine, many people did go back, and not even our highly bureaucratic system right now is able to keep up with the people going back to Ukraine in the moment. So many are choosing a life under threat instead of our system of keeping people in these forced secondary citizen positions. And then the next one. So going back to my other research themes, as I was working with my ethnographic work, I worked with the resettled Afghan community in 2016, and we established a NGO that was run by the community. I have the permission to show this picture. And they all had residency and had a clear path to citizenship from the start. And this is a stark contrast to the Ukrainians who are now struggling to make ends meet and stay in the country. So the issue for the Afghan community was the family members, friends, and relatives who joined them in 2015, migratory movement, and who were not treated as refugees in the system. Many were deported to warlike situations, and some still remain living undocumented and hidden. But the worries of the community were still mostly about language learning, finishing their studies, or getting into the job market. Questions which the Ukrainian newcomers were not even able to think about, as their residency was continuously uncertain, and by default, their family members were and still are in the midst of war. So, our refugee reception system is developed only for people who are wanting to build their lives within the Finnish system, have certain types of residency, rather than for people just staying there for a while, or for people who are fleeing different kinds of complex conflicts. So my research now is part of a project which studies two-way integration. The concept suggests that migrant integration processes should be supported by the so-called host society. But as we see, just from my simple examples, the everyday lives of people may be vastly different from what the policy development or political rhetorics have imagined. For example, I claim that the way in which the temporary protection category was nationally implemented in Finland makes it almost impossible for the arriving Ukrainian migrants to be part of the society, even though there has been wide acceptance and overwhelming support for the newcomers. So I essentially claim that as a researcher, you need to get into the nitty-gritty of the everyday to understand the phenomena of forced migration. If you yourself are working on policy level, at least collaborate with those who also work with the everyday material realities of people. From my studies, I see that in fact bureaucracies work quite differently and are a lot more ambiguous than the framework of welfare state nationalism itself might suggest. So, for example, the recent phenomena of Ukrainian refugees traveling back to their country could be related to so many different factors. The nature of the war and the policy of men having to stay back. It could also be related to the highly bureaucratic nature of the Finnish welfare state. When starting from scratch, it's really difficult if you haven't grown up in the system or know the language. It has been made really difficult. Or it might be just the problems with the daycare arrangements and getting a job, the high taxation, or a number of different issues. But we really need to jump in to understand what's going on. And then I'll finish. I took a little over half an hour. You can put the next one. So to wrap up, I would just bring up 3 points. First of all, I'm interested in your views about this whole conceptual frame of two-way integration. Do you think it's useful in making sense of how people build their lives in a new country of residence? The second issue I wanted to especially bring forward is that I think that administrative bureaucracies need the different needs and goals that more forced migrants have. I would maybe also add that these needs change temporarily, so over time they may become different. And if we really take seriously the idea of two-way integration, we should create flexible systems that allow for different individual circumstances and also respond to different kinds of conflicts and catastrophes. I know it might be impossible sometimes if legal frameworks, for example, are really restrictive or against human rights, even in some places. But perhaps then we could strive for these approaches on a micro scale in sort of everyday street level bureaucracies. So the third point I want to mention is connected to research methods. I suggest that policies, administrative processes, legal frameworks, and everyday life effects are decoupled, and thus research focusing on only one will really lack descriptive power. So, for example, recently myself together with my colleagues have been aiming to develop a new framework for what is called integration in academic discussions. I actually don't like the word integration so much. It has a tone that I would rather avoid, but I use it as it's maybe the most understandable concept. But we have turned to kind of old classics in sociology, Latour and actor network theory. So we have traced the different material elements in the everyday processes of belonging and connecting. So this would be one way of working to understand forced migration. So often the barriers or possibilities for well-being in everyday life may work in surprising ways. In one of our publications, we called this surprising everyday connections adapters, which help newcomers to plug into the surroundings. So, anyways, coming back to the point of decoupling, it is also connected to the theoretical tools that might or might not be useful at different instances. For example, the concept of welfare state nationalism is great when explaining political rhetorics, or to even when looking at policy changes connected to, directly to public discussions. However, the everyday life bureaucracies might then work with a very different logic, and this happened, for example, in the example of Ukrainians in Finland who find it hard to integrate into the society. And of course, this is also because of their short-term residency categories that do not offer full rights and protections. So I leave you with these 3 points, and we can go back and discuss any of the points I brought up, but I'm really interested in what you think. Thank you for listening. Wonderful to be here.
Can I start with the first question? Why don't you like the word integration? Because it has a connotation of homogenization, or?
Really, because I didn't have this actually in my talk. I just said it out of the top of my head because it has this connotation of there are those people who need to integrate. So there's a hierarchy of whose so-called culture. I don't like the word culture either. I don't know what it means really in a specific context. If you talk about a Finnish culture, I wouldn't know what it is, and I would not be a person in any way that would represent that. But so there's this hierarchy of power hierarchy, maybe that some people have to adapt, whereas there's this mainstream culture that is superior in some way.
A set of tasks as well.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Have you not integrated? It creates a bit of a.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the academic scholarship related to these discussions is also a little bit hierarchical and has problematic power relations. So I do not come from the field of integration studies as such. But I do like the idea of two-way integration if we really take it seriously, that it's both ways. It's not only the person having to adapt, but the society also as a whole, but also different groups and collectives, they also have to be constantly kind of evolving and able to get people together. Yeah.
Kind of adding to that, when you talk about two-way integration, are you thinking primarily about sort of a lot of the economic issues that you talked about, like access to welfare, social security, childcare, things along those lines, or is there a, for lack of a better word, cultural aspect to that as well? I mean, I guess language would fit into that maybe to a certain extent, but kind of what is the range of types of integration that you're thinking about when you talk about two-way?
Well, great question. And I'm just starting to work with the term as I'm sort of in the project that utilizes it. I think it could be all of those. I think it's just a concept that kind of forces you to think about more than just the individual. You have to also think of the surroundings of the whole society, different networks. So anything would be, discrimination would go into that. So if you, in a sense, if we continue with the examples I had, it would be for Ukrainians arriving to Finland. It would not be like a two-way integration, positive experience from the bureaucratic side or administrative side, which I can pronounce better than bureaucracies. Somehow this word is for me too much. So but in a sense, then that would of course be or supportive in a two-way integration sense, that people are welcoming the Ukrainians. Whereas for the Afghan community that I worked with previously, it would be the other way around. There was a lot of racism. There was a lot of really negative stuff happening. But then again, the systems were at place, and this was also a coincidence. Like I'm saying, it is ambiguous, so you don't always know, and the ambiguousness comes from the real life of people going from place to place. As many of you know, if you have lived in other countries, Lane at least has. So there are a lot of aspects that can come in your way. Even as a like a, if you think about more privileged migration, there are a lot of hurdles that you can just get wrapped up in, and it's really ambiguous, and it's not necessarily what you would think of that becomes a problem. So I guess at least in Finland, we have this system of integration. It's called integration services, and people are part of it for the first 3 years they are in Finland. But it's really, really catered for refugees and for refugees that don't have prior education, and then it's really difficult for 2 different groups: those refugees who really don't have any education, don't know how to read and write in their own language. It's not suited. But also for those who have higher education and would have like aspirations other than a car mechanic, becoming a car mechanic. So yeah.
So I guess I have a couple of questions, but I want to start off with. So I'm trying to wrap my head around how two-way integration is distinct from what people think a lot about in terms of inclusion or accommodation on kind of the supply on the demand side, which is like often an important concept. I think the reason why it's difficult to put the two dimensions in the same is because we're focusing on different levels. I mean, integration, we think of the individual level and how well an individual refugee integrates. That's kind of normally how we think about it. And the dynamic that you're talking about is really at the society level, like how accommodating is the society. And so two integration is kind of a little bit difficult then to measure because we're comparing an individual level factor to kind of a community or group level factor. So that's, I guess, my first question in terms of how that fits in. And my second point is, I was a little bit confused, I guess, in terms of there's on the one hand, there's the legal framework, and the legal framework has shifted. The legal framework works differently for different types of refugees, but it's as much the legal framework as it is the motivations and the expectations of refugees. Because I mean, you made the big distinction at the beginning, how it was the distinction if you compare Ukraine to 2015, that it was race, but it is race, education, sex, proximity, and reason for displacement. And that reason for displacement is a huge one because the expectation of most people in 2015 realistically was not that they were going to return to their countries because they were seeking refuge in a country where they could build a better life. Most Ukrainians very deeply want to return to their own country, especially those who left, women, children. And so I think on the one hand, yes, it's the legal framework, but it's not just the legal framework, it's the legal framework and the motivations don't match.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. But now I forgot the first question when I was concentrating.
I'm trying to understand what.
Oh yeah, it was the inclusion.
Is
Yeah, there's not necessarily any novelty, but I mean, I think it's a neat concept to kind of question the individuality of the integration. So making it a structural issue rather than only individual issue. But yeah. I mean,
for me, that's something that the study of accommodation and study of inclusion is central to, I think, that research program. I think they think about the relationship between the individual and society. I mean, I'm not in that field. That seems like.
Yeah, it tends to be a little bit psychological. That maybe or then in studies of integration itself, it's usually getting a job, learning the language, and really like individualized, like you said. Inclusion is a good word. Yeah. Yeah.
The distinction between inclusion and accommodation. It's like how much do they get included in society and how much does society accommodate?
Yeah, exactly. It is. Yeah, you could use those.
Because that dimension also then differs in those two dimensions because it's very easy to include Ukrainian refugees because they look the same, they have similar socioeconomic backgrounds, and so their inclusion is potentially the goal. But the goal in terms of for Syrian refugees might not be inclusion, but rather accommodation, because inclusion or integration would imply that you take away the host or the original kind of religious or cultural practices. And so there,
Yeah.
maybe it's like, what can you do to actually be accommodated in society?
Yeah, interesting point. I might not have an answer, but I certainly think that this is a really good idea to start working on. Yes, in a sense, but then again, for example, the inclusion of Ukrainians is just really not happening at all. So what I was trying to get at, and maybe I'm not ready in my thoughts at all, but why is it that it's like all the different reasons that you gave? Actually, I completely agree. It's completely intersectional how people are able to fit into new surroundings, sort of. But because I really have wondered myself. I'm starting also a new research program or a project where we work with Ukrainians and Bosnian refugees that came in the 90s. So kind of trying to compare what the issues are and maybe finding some similarities and differences also. So, but I think it really, yeah. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. This is great. I think you are onto something there. Yeah.
I don't study this, but yeah, I think there is the literature on accommodation. I think is maybe where you want to kind of look with the two integration, because I do think some of the considerations that they think about, that distinction between integration and accommodation, I think might be part of the two integration that you talk about.
Yeah, but then again, I would maybe question the narrative a bit. For example, many Syrian refugees, they did come with a sense of wanting to go back. So so I think it's more complex than that. Yeah.
I don't know if this is part of what you've looked into with your field research, but have other European countries had more extensive integration policies for Ukrainians specifically? So have they extended like longer residency permits? Do they have like more all-encompassing services that they're offering compared to Finland?
I don't. I'm not sure. At least in Sweden, they are in some sense, but all the permits are short. But in Finland, we because they took this already, this permit that had been existing, and they just applied the same rules that were tied and connected to that permit to this new situation. So that kind of resulted the lack of rights that this permit type had attached, but I'm not sure. But the permits are really short. I know in most countries in Poland there are so many refugees right now that I know they are really struggling. And I'm in Germany also. There are a lot of unaccompanied minors also. And because the movement is quite free right now, people can flee Ukraine. So there are a lot of people and children that are unaccounted for. So it's pretty much like any refugee situation. These things are always there.
If I could ask a last follow-up question, I'm wondering if the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed the migrant composition, either qualitatively or quantitatively. So I'm going to assume before the Russian invasion, on your chart that showed the percentage that were coming from Russia, I'm assuming previously a large number of them were probably Russian marginalized minorities like Uyghurs.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering now if maybe perhaps a larger number of applicants in Finland are men trying to avoid conscription into the Russian army. And if that's the case, does that change the Finnish reception to these Russians who are trying to avoid army service? And could that change structures for integration?
Yeah, definitely. The numbers of people wanting to avoid the service are not hugely high, but I don't remember if it's in hundreds or thousands, but there is a group of people applying, but we haven't yet made a decision whether they will be granted asylum or whether they will be deported. So right now, the people who have applied a year ago, Russians avoiding service, are still waiting because they are still trying to figure out what to do and discussing with the EU level decisions. Yeah. It's heartbreaking on all possible sides, but right now we are not granting asylum to those who are fleeing the armed services, but it might be that we will be. But it also might be that it will be focused to only those who face the possible torture. So I don't know. It's a very precarious situation at the moment. But yes, the composition of migrants in many countries, certainly in countries next to Ukraine, have changed. And a lot of Eastern European countries that were actually horrible in the 2015 refugee crisis were, refugees were staying in prison-like camps. Well, you are not doing so well here either, but so they are now taking in Ukrainians, and this is certainly like a nationalistic and I think also a racialized dynamic. But it's not so easy to label these policies because it's also people who are near, people who are, there are also all these. I sort of wanted to hint into the emotional reasons why it's also different. But yeah. And there's a lot. I had when I started to prepare.
So I'm just kind of leave that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's fine. When I was preparing this talk, I was thinking I'll start with gender, class, and race, but then I was like, "There's no way I can unpack this in 30 minutes." So, but yeah.
One other question, just kind of changing gears a little bit to the methodology that you talked about and sort of this idea of decoupling politics and bureaucracies. I think it's a really cool idea. It seems like, kind of like you hinted at, a lot of the work on this so far focuses on the populist radical right and their response to it. I'm curious how much you've gotten into sort of the bureaucracy side. So I know there's this big literature on how bureaucracies can sort of evolve their own set of interests and things along those lines. So I'm curious what you found so far about if these bureaucracies do have a distinct set of interests that are different from politics or general society in Finland, and also just kind of related to that, how insulated are these bureaucracies from the politics and the sort of pressure from citizens and other groups when these refugee crises are.
Great question. So I do a lot of work with sociologists. So yes, I have thought about this, and I think the decoupling of what I wanted to hint to right there is that they do have, and the consequences can be completely random. So when you start looking at the officials who shuffle papers and do the decisions and what happens there, it's a completely different picture. It might be, and it might seem to the public that yes, the kind of the political rhetoric or public discussions or politics, anything kind of steers what is done, but then it's very material, and that's what I want to get to, and that's really my focus right now. I'm still working with these issues, but trying to get more into the material reality. So what we are doing right now in our project is we are utilizing walking methodologies, and we are also thinking about trust and connecting to your surroundings and different issues like this, and following people long term. So I have this ethnographic study I started in, well, really 2015, but I got the funding in 2016. And I've been in contact with these people since then. And I want to, at some point, have the possibility to write about more of a life trajectory thing from these different studies, since it's, I mean, people live their lives, and people can also, as you know, in migration scholars, people also live their lives in a complete limbo. So deportations, re-deportations, and coming back, and so forth. So I'm interested in this. So yeah, I think I moved from being interested in political discussions, rhetorics, to very everyday life material realities, and that's what I want to focus on now. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question at all, but yeah.
We had a shy audience today.
Well, probably wrap up then, since we're at time. But thank you very much for coming and presenting. This was great to hear about. I think I think there are a million different directions you could take this project, so it'll be cool to see kind of where you end up going. But this is really interesting. So thank you very much for taking the time to present for us today.
Yeah, and you can show my email is in the next. And again, hinting to that book.
Thank
Thank you again.
Thank you.